Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 211, March 24th to March 30th, 1865. Last week, we covered the final acts of the subtheater of the war in the battles of Averysboro and Bentonville. Sherman is going to fend off an attempt to defeat his army piecemeal, and will soon be turning his attention to Raleigh. This week, we will mop up on what is going on in Alabama, but first we will launch what is considered to be the final offensive action for the Army of Northern Virginia. Of course, we do need to talk a little bit about our Patreon content, and we will be moving back to a picture slideshow for next month, and actually, just as a quick note, I believe if you look at the Patreon that has already been released now, had a little bit of a snafu with scheduling that, so that should be ready to go. But we did a picture slideshow for the month of April, and that's going to show multiple locations, including Fort Stedman, which we will talk about today in the episode. But we also have pictures from Five Forks and Sailor's Creek, so two more actions that we're going to be talking about here coming up shortly that are going to lead to Appomattox. So if that sounds like it would interest you, we also have some memoir reviews, we have movie reviews, and if any of that sounds like it might be interesting to you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. By March of 1865, Robert E. Lee could understand the desperate situation that his army was in. While there was a positive in that recuperating troops were returning to the ranks, the supply going into Richmond and Petersburg was an issue, in addition to desertions. Grant had been besieging the cities for quite some time, and was continuing to choke out the rebels. With Johnson in North Carolina, Lee desired to maybe link up with his army. It would give him some numbers once again, although facing Grant and Sherman was going to be a tall task indeed. Before he could link up in the Carolinas, the siege would need to be broken. What better place to finally break through than relatively where the battle lines halted with the assault of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. A Union fort named Fort Stedman after a fallen officer from the 11th Connecticut stood there, very close to the Confederate works, here known as Colquitt's Salient. The lines here were close and considered to be weaker, therefore a prime spot for an assault. Lee's list of capable officers, though, was growing thinner. He would, though, still have someone who could be considered one of the best amateur officers of the war, in John B. Gordon. Gordon, if you recall, had arrived with the rest of his veterans from the Valley following Jubal Early's failure there. He would be tasked with an attempt to break through the Federal lines. Gordon would plan the potential assault, utilizing his own men, some 18,000, with reinforcements from Bushrod Johnson's division. This would include Matt Ransom's brigade. Johnson, by this point, has brigades under Henry Wise and William Wallace, with Matt Ransom's North Carolina troops being legit combat veterans. Facing off against the Confederates would be John Parke's 9th Corps. His command would include a division under Orlando Wilcox and one under John Hartranft, both of these officers having been in our story previously, especially in regards to the 9th Corps and their operations. Remember, though, too, that the 9th Corps had been primarily involved with the attack on the crater, so there was a big officer overhaul after that action, right? Burnside's going to get sort of the boot here. Edward Ferraro is another officer. James Ledlie. So you have kind of a restructuring of that corps following that debacle. Hartranft would have a mixed bag of Pennsylvania regiments, replacements all numbering in the 200s. So if you recall our mentoring of the number system, and when it came to federal regiments, these were formed much later in the war. So essentially the higher number that you had, then that means the later it was actually created. So if you have somebody who, say, in the first, fifth, right, even into like the 20th, even into really, your kind of, for your larger states, your 100 level regiments, those have at least been around for some time. So for Pennsylvania regiments to be here in the 200s, that gives you an idea that they really haven't seen any combat at all. And I think it's one of the things that we pointed out when we had our Red Badge of Courage movie review, that they were supposed to be part of a Ohio regiment that was in the 300s, and we don't quite get that far. Here we have Pennsylvania in the 200s at the start of 1865. Wilcox does have Napoleon Bonaparte McLaughlin as a brigade commander, the man responsible for the sector. He was a career soldier, serving in the 1st U.S. Cavalry before shifting to infantry, commanding a Massachusetts regiment, the 1st, until it was mustered out. From here he took over the 57th before brigade command. Gordon, in the meantime, would set up a pretty intricate plan of attack to accomplish what Lee had requested. He had his own men and Johnston's as mentioned, but also had brigades from A.P. Hill, Pickett's command, all in support. In all, Gordon was going to launch an attack with half of the troops available for the Army of Northern Virginia. Additionally, there would be groups of soldiers sent forward to remove the abattis and any other obstructions in front of Fort Stedman. It was not out of the norm for the Union troops to receive Confederate deserters wishing to surrender, so Gordon wished to use this against them. In addition, part of the defenses would be batteries 10 and 11 supporting the fort. These would have to also be taken. Special groups of sharpshooters were tasked with getting into the second line of northern works. A signal shot would notify that the attack was to begin. Early in the morning at approximately 4 a.m., the attack would commence. Amazingly, Gordon's assault was a resounding success. Stedman and the batteries would fall into Confederate hands fairly quickly. McLaughlin would make sure that the next fort on the line, Fort Haskell, was well situated before moving to Fort Stedman, where he would be captured along with 1,000 or so other Union troops. John Hartranft would spring into action. He would rally enough troops of his own command and from other corps to converge. The Confederates, though, would be confused by their success. As a result, they would branch out very little, and a half-hearted attack on Fort Haskell was easily parried. Actually, we do go over that in our picture slideshow that is actually posted as of now. We actually show the terrain in which they would have had to go over to get to Fort Haskell, so it would have been a hard task indeed, especially if you have Union defenders within that work that are ready to receive you. So if you're doing it very quickly before there's any time for a response, then perhaps you might see some success, but as it was, there was not quite that sense of urgency once the breakthrough occurred. The Confederates would be contained and pushed back to the breakthrough point. With the batteries retaken, the situation proved deadly for the rebels. Lee would call on Gordon to retreat, the Confederates making back to their own lines. Many, though, would not wish to go back across the no man's land, as this was going to be proving a deadly prospect, and instead would surrender. Union casualties would be at somewhere around 1,000, with 4,000 being lost on the part of the Confederates, with a large majority captured. John B. Gordon would recount the events of the assault in his personal recollections. My troops stood in close column, ready for the hazardous rush upon Fort Stedman. While the fraternal dialogue in reference to drawing rations from the cornfield was progressing between the Union picket and a resourceful private at my side, the last of the obstructions in my front were removed, and I ordered the private to fire the signal for the assault. He pointed his rifle upward and with his finger on the trigger, but hesitated. His conscience seemed to get a hold of him. He was going into the fearful charge, and he evidently did not feel disposed to go into eternity with a lie on his lips, although it would be permissible for a lie in war, which he had thrown the Union picket off guard. He evidently felt that it was hardly fair to make such advantage of the generosity and soldierly sympathy of his foe, who had so magnanimously assured him that he would not be shot while drawing his rations from the little field of corn. His hesitation surprised me, and I again ordered, "Fire a gun, sir." He at once called to his kind-hearted foe and said, "Hello, Yank, wake up, we are going to shell the woods. Look out, we are coming." and with this effort to satisfy his conscience and even up accounts with the Yankee picket, he fired the shot and rushed forward in the darkness. So here we have even Gordon is giving us a good account of the kind of relationship that you have if you were having pickets that are so close together, especially in situations where they are so close, right? And you have kind of this unspoken kind of rule, this bond with the enemy picket. And we especially had this at the end of the Overland campaign at Cold Harbor, where they are going to yell to each other if they're going to have to assault or bombard with artillery or fire upon them in any other way. So this would be a good example of that. Even in this situation, it's a desperate situation for the Confederates. They're trying to break out. They're trying to break through, right? And they need to make sure that this works out for the assault. There's even still this kind of sense of camaraderie, even with your enemy here in this situation. So the individual who Gordon has brought on to launch that signal is definitely having a sense of wanting to fulfill the obligation to his conscience. Now, you could also say this is also an example of the fact that, earlier in the war, say in 1862, this probably wouldn't have happened the same way, where, here toward the end of the war, there's a big, overwhelming idea that, hey, we just need to make it through this, and the war's almost over anyway, so there's no need of getting killed in a situation like this. So you could also point to that as motivation as well. As the solitary signal shot rang out in the stillness, my alert pickets, who had crept close to the Union sentinels, sprang like sinewy Ajaxes upon them, and prevented the discharge of a single alarm shot. Had these faithful Union sentinels been permitted to fire alarm guns, my dense columns, while rushing upon the fort, would have been torn into fragments by the heavy guns. Simultaneously with the seizing and silencing of the Federal sentinels, my stalwart axemen leaped over our breastworks, closely followed by the selected 300 and the packed column of infantry. Although it required but a few minutes to reach the Union works, those minutes were to me like hours of suspense and breathless anxiety. But soon was heard the thud of axes, and my brave fellows slashed down the Federal obstructions. The next moment, the infantry sprang upon the Union breastworks and into the fort, overpowering the gunners before their destructive charges could be emptied into the mass of Confederates. They turned this captured artillery upon the flanking lines on each side of the fort, clearing the Union breastworks of their defenders for some distance in both directions. Up to this point, the success had exceeded my most sanguine expectations. We had taken Fort Stedman and a long line of breastworks on either side. We had captured 9 heavy cannon, 11 mortars, nearly 1,000 prisoners, including General McLaughlin, with a loss of less than half a dozen men. Of these fell upon the works, pierced through the body by a Federal bayonet, one of the few men thus killed in the 4 years of war. I was in the fort myself, and relieved General McLaughlin by assuming command of Fort Stedman. There's also kind of just to point out here, he does mention how it doesn't really happen too often where you have an individual being killed with a bayonet, and we've talked about that before, how hand-to-hand combat, at least in its true sense of hand-to-hand combat with bayonets and clubbed weapons, is very rare. It does happen on occasion during these battles, but you don't see a whole lot of casualties resulting from that. From the fort, I sent word to General Lee, who was on the hill in the rear, that we were in the works, and that 300 were on their way to the lines in the rear. Soon I received a message from one of these 3 officers, I believe General Lewis of North Carolina, that he had passed the line of Federal infantry without trouble by representing himself as a colonel of the 100th Pennsylvania, but that he could not find his fort, as the guide had been lost in the rush upon Fort Stedman. I soon received a similar message from the other 2, and so notified General Lee. Daylight was coming. Through the failure of the 3 guides, we had failed to occupy the 3 forts in the rear, and they were now filled with Federals. Our wretched railroad trains had broken down, and the troops who were coming to my aid did not reach me. The full light of the morning revealed the gathering forces of Grant, and the great preponderances of his numbers. It was impossible for me to make further headway with my isolated corps, and General Lee directed me to withdraw. This was not easily accomplished. Foiled by the failures of our guides, deprived of the great bodies of infantry which Lee ordered to my support, I had necessarily stretched out my corps to occupy the entrenchments which we had captured. The other troops were expected to arrive and join us in the general advance. The breaking down of the trains and the non-arrival of these heavy supports left me to battle alone with Grant's gathering and overwhelming forces, and at the same time to draw in my own lines toward Fort Stedman. A consuming fire on both flanks and front during this withdrawal caused a heavy loss to my command. I myself was wounded, but not seriously, in recrossing the space over which we had charged in the darkness. Among the disabled was the gallant Brigadier General Philip Cook of Georgia, who after the war represented his people in the United States Congress. When the retreat to our own works had ended, a report reached me that an entire Confederate regiment had not received the order to withdraw, and was still standing in the Union breastworks bravely fighting. It was necessary to send them orders or leave them to their fate. I called my staff around me and explained the situation and the extreme danger the officer would encounter in carrying that order. I stated to them that the pain I experienced in sending one of them in so perilous a mission was greater than I could express. Every one of them quickly volunteered to go, but Thomas G. Jones of Alabama insisted that he was the youngest and had no special responsibilities. It should fall to his lot to incur the danger. I bade him goodbye, with earnest prayers that God would protect him, and without an apparent tremor he rode away. A portion of the trip was through a literal furnace of fire, but he passed through it, both going and returning without a scratch. This last supreme effort to break the hold of General Grant upon Petersburg and Richmond was the expiring struggle of the Confederate giant, whose strength was nearly exhausted, and whose limbs were heavily shackled by the most onerous conditions. Lee knew, as we all did, that the chances against us were as 100 to 1, but we remembered how General Washington, with his band of ragged rebels, had won American independence through trials and sufferings and difficulties, and although they were far less discouraging and insurmountable than those around us, they were nevertheless many and great. It seemed better, therefore, to take one chance, though it might be 1 in 1,000, rather than to stand still while the little army was being depleted, its vitality lessening with each of the setting sun, and its life gradually ebbing away, while the great army on its front was growing and strengthening day by day. To wait was certain destruction. It could not be worse if we tried and failed. The accidents and mishaps which checked the brilliant assault made by my brave men, and which rendered their further advance impossible, could not have been anticipated. But for those adverse happenings, it would seem that we might have won on that single chance. The spasm of Confederate aggression vigor inaugurated the period of more than 2 weeks of almost incessant battle, beginning on the morning of March 25th, with the charge of my troops at Petersburg, and ending with the last charge of Lee's army by these same men on the morning of April 9th at Appomattox. So there we go, actually a good segue into some of our future episodes, how it's going to be kind of constant action, if not like kind of the larger scale battles that we've been used to seeing, at least it's going to be action in terms of there's always going to be kind of something happening from here on out. This is kind of the beginning of the end. When we think about it, we're going to start to get into the road to Appomattox in some ways. I think it does start here. Something else we need to point out, though, that I think is interesting, and we mentioned it in actually a couple other episodes. Notably, we had an episode where we talked about the motivations of soldiers and why they fought and kind of getting a better idea of their mindset going into these things. Obviously, Gordon is one of them. He's going to invoke the revolution, right? Both sides actually did, which is interesting. And even here, writing afterwards, he's going to mention that, how, they're both drawing inspiration from George Washington. And especially if you have Confederates, they are going to kind of hang on to that ideal of there's this large invading force, this empire that they have to beat, and they're going to have strength from the fact that the revolutionaries are going to end up on top in the revolution. Because if we think about it too, and we think about it with the timeline of our country, in that we haven't been around for too awfully long, especially compared to European nations, and certainly at the time of the Civil War, the revolution was not that long ago, right? You still have guys walking around who served in 1812. You still have those who, as children, if they're a little bit older, maybe they remember at least their parents telling them about the revolution. So, if we think about it like that, we're not too many generations removed from that time. So it's probably something that's at the top of mind for a lot of people. The same way that we probably think about maybe World War II now, in that we are kind of getting out of that generation is sort of dying off, but not that long ago, right? Not that long ago compared to right now, at least at the time of this recording of this podcast. I guess one last thought, too, about Fort Stedman is that it does give us kind of this picture of how the Confederate Army is here in the latter stages of the war. This is a really tough effort to have to get through. Gordon even admits as much as that a lot of things have to go right at this plan. It's kind of a long shot, and they're not going to necessarily be able to operate with the same thoughts on success that they probably have had with some of these other operations. So a lot of things have to go right, and they don't. They don't go right? You have the initial part that is a success, and then there's supposed to be some guides that are leading people places. There's a lot of intricate moving parts. The logistical structure is kind of in a poetic way. It's going to fail the Confederates in getting reinforcements to Gordon. Gordon's also going to kind of be like we talked about this in the Valley campaign. He also kind of sheds blame in certain places where he says, it's not really my fault. And there's some people that even point out that, hey, maybe Jubal Early wasn't as kind of incompetent. He's kind of painted it sort of in that picture for Cedar Creek. It's all his fault. And maybe that wasn't necessarily the case, or at least maybe it wasn't to the degree that maybe somebody like Gordon kind of paints in his recollections. But we have maybe a little bit of the excuse train here, and then it does give us still a good example of how just things are just not the same as 1860, not the same as 1863. Shoot, not even probably the same as the beginning of 64 when we're getting into the Overland campaign. Gordon had a great idea to launch this attack at the Wilderness, and that could have been a game changer for that battle. And we probably would have, at least in my mind, a slightly different discussion. It probably would not have deterred Grant from continuing on the Overland campaign, but it might have been a slightly different discussion following that battle. So there you have a great example of something that he's undertaking with less troops. And we'll think about these other actions that Lee's going to have where he's using half his army, and he's half his army on an assault. It's usually winding up a success. And we don't have a whole lot of examples of that. Gaines's Mill could be one example where he's throwing overwhelming force at an isolated part of the Union Army, and that is his first big victory. So if we recall from our talking about the Selma raid by Wilson, that there was a secondary target for Curtis's command coming out of Pensacola. While Mobile Bay had been secured by the U.S. Navy, the town of Mobile had not yet been taken. Supporting columns, one from the south and the other from the north, would hopefully accomplish this task. Wilson, as we have talked about, would be pushing on the industrial center to the north. Initial attention was drawn away from his mounted columns by the move on the southern part of the state. Canby had been in the area, and he did not have enough men to take the city. By 1865, though, he had 32,000 men for which to operate. The Confederates would see their commander as Randall Gibson, who had brought his Louisiana regiments in the defense of the city. These would combine with Alabama regiments to make a couple thousand defenders. Remember, there is a big dispersion of the secondary field army for the Confederates, so they're going to go in a couple different places. Obviously, going to Johnson, we talked about that last week. These are going to be some reinforcements that are at least be going to Mobile. What was more, there was a ring of forts that protected the city. One of these was known as Old Spanish Fort. This would be the target of the oncoming Blue Ranks. Canby was able to arrive in the area of Mobile in late March. By April, the Federals would begin the investment of the forts. Canby would not only be at a numerical advantage, but would also be able to bring a large amount of artillery to the field, some 90 guns, that could be used against the rebels, who could really only respond with around 30. This would be another example of the vast superiority the North generally showed in this area, as we had mentioned in previous episodes. A general bombardment, of course, would commence. An assault would be launched on April 8th on the weaker north side of Spanish Fort. The 8th Iowa would break through the main line of earthworks, looking to exploit beyond. With the fort partially in federal hands, Gibson would see it as a tall task even for his venerated Pelican Staters. The Confederates would withdraw and abandon Mobile. With Lee having surrendered to Appomattox at this point, Mobile would be given up peacefully. Canby's troops would be able to walk in. 300 Federals would become casualties compared to 1,500 Confederates, again, mostly uncaptured. While Mobile was taken out as a real, strategically relevant position in 1864, it is an example of another southern city falling into northern hands. So here we have Mobile finally coming to a close, and in many ways this kind of wraps up any southern ports, at least the southern major ports that we had, all coming into Union hands. We had the Battle of Mobile Bay back in 1864 that kind of eliminates Mobile as being a threat, right? The town is still in Confederate hands, so then you finally have here the campaign beginning in March and ending up in April 1865 that will conclude the threat of Mobile. It does give you a good idea too. I think it's actions like this that not really a whole lot happens. There is an assault by Union troops, and then there is a weak defense, obviously, by the Confederates. But it kind of highlights exactly when we have these arguments of the Union troops would have more in their numbers than Confederates, and there are some people who say, well, there are longer odds for the Confederates to come out on top than there are other examples in history, right? You could have that argument that the Confederates could have been able to pull it out in certain situations. And there's always kind of this trope of how the Union has just more manpower, and that's kind of why they win. And that kind of ties into a little bit with lost cause narrative a little bit. But I will say this, is that there is a great example of right here in Mobile in why exactly there is kind of this thought process of manpower. There's 32,000 men that are able to show up at Mobile, but especially by this stage in the war, 32,000 men is going to go a long way for Johnson, for Lee, really anywhere, right? And there's just not that kind of number available for the rebels at this point. So while there is maybe a focus on the main theaters of the war and how there's not too much of a discrepancy all the time, we do have these sections of the war, as we tried to highlight through the entire process, the entire narrative here, where there are significant numerical advantages, and they just kind of start to add up. And certainly by 1865, they were all going to add up to Union victory. So we're going to go ahead and call it a day right there. This week we had the final offensive action of the Army of Northern Virginia with their attack on Fort Stedman. While the execution is going to work, or at least the initial execution, the Army of Northern Virginia is not what they once were, unable to exploit their initial success. Mobile has been another city that is going to fall to Northern forces. Next week, we're going to stay around Petersburg. We will fight the Battle of Five Forks, as well as finally have the Union breakthrough. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.